Hey, what's good, family? Dr. Jones here, and I'm here to give you some insight on Black history. I am here in Central Florida, and in Florida in the last few years, there's been a lot of discrepancy in the public news about Black history and Black history curriculum in schools. I am not a teacher in the schools, and I do not work in the schools, but I do assist and go to the schools as needed when I'm called on. Yet I want you to understand that I am only here to give insight to the young people about Black history in depth that they may not get in school. Now, I want to give a shout out to how I was raised. I was raised by some civil rights activists, not just my parents, but those in Cleveland, Ohio. We had this program called SOS. It's called Strengthening Our Students. And in that program, every Saturday we went and we did reading, writing, and math. And then after that, we all came together and we learned about Black history. The NAACP was a huge part of our life growing up. So we had to learn about W.E.B. Du Bois, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Ida B. Wells, Maya Angelou, and not just learn about them, we had to memorize and recite their writings and know what they have done as it was impactful to not just the African American community, but to America. And that's one thing about Black history that we are not always taught in our schools, that Black history is American history. Of course, there's European history, Asian history, South American history, African history, all that good stuff. And there are 54 beautiful countries that make up the continent of Africa. Yet a lot of our history is not known. So what we have done, we have taken a lot of information and put it down based on the topics that are given in the Florida State approved Black history curriculum. And we went deep to talk about it, to bring it right home to you here. Additionally, in 2023, Florida approved new Black history curriculum guidelines that have been criticized for suggesting that enslaved individuals benefited from slavery by developing skills. I've read through most of the Black history curriculum guidelines here in Florida, and it does highlight that slaves did benefit from slavery by developing skills, but it also says a whole lot more, and it doesn't go in depth. What's the problem with that? The problem with this statement is a lot, because it downplays and belittles the evil that slavery actually was in this country. To say that a group of people who were belittled and were just considered labor benefited from developing skills kind of overshadows all the things that have happened to African Americans when they came to this country and what was taken from them and what they had to endure. There was nothing to benefit from being a slave in any manner. So what we're going to do, we're going to go through some history, give you some insight about the transatlantic slave trade and the enslavement era, the Middle Passage, and the effects of slavery that we still see alive and well today. So, what is the transatlantic slave trade? Do you know? Do you really know? Well, we do know it was forced migration of millions of Africans to Americas, the conditions they endured, and the establishment of slavery in the American colonies. Approximately 12 to 15 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and transported across the Atlantic to the Americas. Of those captured, 10 to 12 million survived the horrific Middle Passage. And when they survived the Middle Passage, they were sold into slavery in the Americas. Now, many died en route on the Middle Passage to Americas because it was inhumane in every aspect. The Middle Passage refers to the journey across the Atlantic Ocean from the west coast of Africa all the way to the east coast of the USA. The death rates on the Middle Passage range from 15 to 20%. Causes included malnutrition, abuse, and even suicide by those who preferred death over enslavement. Enslaved individuals were tightly packed below decks in small compartments with very limited space to move, often chained to prevent escape. The ships were overcrowded and the conditions were unsanitary, leading to a spread of diseases such as smallpox and malaria. The lack of fresh air, the extreme heat, and the insufficient food and water exacerbated the situation. The journey across the Atlantic took between 6 to 12 weeks. Now, the journey depended on the weather and the conditions of the ship, because not all ships were top-tier ships. There were storms and piracy and other dangers that made the passage even more dangerous and prolonged suffering for those on board. Even after the slave trade was banned in America in 1808, slavery itself was not banned. Get that. Slave trade was legally banned in 1808, but slavery was not. It wasn't until the Civil War and the ratification of slavery in 1865. I want to make this clear. In 1808, the slave trade was banned, meaning they looked the other way when they still went and got ships of slaves and brought them over to the Americas. The problem with that is, though they legally banned the slave trade, the U.S. Naval Academy, the European Naval Academy, the European Navy, they looked the other way when ships still went and stole Africans from Africa. They just looked the other way. How do we know that? Because the last slave ship came into the U.S. through Alabama called the Clotilda in 1860. Let's get to the economics of the slave trade. How did the slave trade work? Who was involved in the slave trade? It was a triangular trade system. The transatlantic slave trade was a part of a triangular trade system involving three main legs. European ships brought manufactured goods to Africa. Enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic to the Americas, which was the Middle Passage, and American goods like sugar, cotton, and tobacco produced through enslaved labor were shipped back to Europe, generating profits that fueled the cycle. The demand for labor in the Americas drove European traders to establish a profitable system of capturing and trading African people. Also keep in mind, those people in America, if they were not Native American, they were Europeans who settled in America. Okay? So this is how America and Europe got together with the slave trade in a nutshell. So when Europeans went to Africa, they got African rulers and traders participated by selling prisoners of war, criminals, and rival ethnic groups to European traders in exchange for guns and goods, alcohol, and textiles. Europe went to Africa, found some leaders, and said, hey, we got something for you if you give us some slaves. And they said, okay, no problem, in a nutshell, all right? So other Africans betrayed other Africans, those are other different ethnic groups in Africa, and then they gave them over to the Europeans for guns, alcohol, textiles, and sugar. So we got to be mindful of it. Europe didn't just walk up to the shores of Africa and say, hey, we're going to take all your people. They used our own to get our own. European merchants and companies profited significantly from each stage of the slave trade. Ships left Europe loaded with manufactured goods that were traded for enslaved people in Africa. Enslaved Africans were then sold in the Americas at high prices. Estimated profits per enslaved individual could reach 300 to 600% of the original investment, making it one of the most profitable businesses of all time. Insurance companies also profited by providing insurance policies on slave ships, compensating traders for lost cargo if enslaved individuals died or were thrown overboard. Young people, hear me well. This is a business. It was an evil business, okay? It was an evil business making Africans to slave labor in a completely different country, a completely different continent. So how were they able to do it? They had to be funded by somewhere, right? By someone, right? They had to be. Financial institutions were developed by this infrastructure of slavery. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean, for example, generated massive wealth with sugar referred to as white gold. It was one of the most lucrative commodities in the 18th century, significantly enriching European nations. And cotton made up 60% of U.S. exports and provided raw materials to fuel the British and European textile industries, which were central to the Industrial Revolution. Now, what were the financial institutions that were funding this whole project? This three-continent project. Who was doing it? Many banks, including predecessors to J.P. Morgan and Chase, Citibank and Barclays, financed the slave trade and held investments tied to slavery. And they generated substantial profits. Insurance companies in the U.S. and Europe sold policies that protected slaveholders' assets, creating profits for companies like Aetna and Lloyd's of London. The profits from slavery financed infrastructure projects, including roads, ports, and railroads in both Europe and the United States, which furthered economic growth and industrial development. Slavery was a capital investment. Slaves represented a significant portion of the South's wealth. In 1860, the estimated value of enslaved people in the South was around $3 billion. In today's money, that's between $100 and $150 billion today. So what was the individual worth of a slave? The price of an individual slave varied, but on average, a healthy adult male could sell for around $800 to $1,200 in the 1850s, which would be equivalent to approximately $25,000 to $35,000 today. All in all, by 1860, J.P. Morgan and Chase used more than 13,000 slaves as collateral and wound up owning about 1,250 of them. Just in collateral, J.P. Morgan had about $14.25 million in 1860s currency. wealth gap in the South started back then. Because of the slave trade and all the money it was bringing in, the U.S. was able to expand west. The 13 colonies sat on the east coast of the country, and there were only 33 states before the Civil War. 15 were slave states and 18 were free states. The key compromises, like the Missouri Compromise in 1820 and the Compromise in 1850, tried to maintain a balance of free and slave states as new states joined. This kind of legislation in 1820 and 1850 was not adapted for the people, it was adapted to control money. Have you ever heard of the 1%? The really rich people in this country and the world? The 1%, even though they have a range of sources of income, the impact of slavery and systemic racism undeniably contributed to wealth concentration and racial inequality. This legacy plays a crucial role in the economic landscape of the United States today. The total population in the country by 1860 was about 31.4 million people. There were 33 states, 15 free states, 18 slave states. Most slaves were in the South. About 347,000 of them owned slaves, which means roughly 1% of the U.S. population owned slaves. That 1% created a wealth gap in that country that will never be achieved again. You follow that? The amount of wealth that was amassed back in 1860s and during slavery is extreme. And it will never be done again. Not like that, not at all. The plantation owners accumulated wealth and often carried over generations, creating dynasties and contributing to wealth inequality that persists today. Families with large holdings of enslaved individuals grew wealthy, using profits to expand estates, engage in political influence, and invest in emerging industries. The slavery-generated wealth also led to the establishment of institutions like universities, Harvard, Georgetown, and commercial enterprises that contributed to intergenerational wealth and privilege. These extreme profits just weren't in the U.S., they were in Europe as well. The transatlantic slave trade and the slave economy, the enslavement era, influenced global trade patterns, like linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas. European nations became wealthier and more powerful, reinvesting profits in colonial expansion and global trade dominance. In the Caribbean, sugar produced by enslaved labor created enormous wealth, particularly for Britain, France, and the Netherlands, establishing dominance in global markets and leading to the rapid growth of port cities and trade hubs like Liverpool, Bordeaux, and Amsterdam. European nations, including Portugal, Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, were deeply involved in the slave trade, establishing fortified trading posts along the West African coast. Now, all of this money led to what, especially in the U.S.? It led to political power. It led to political influence as well, because those who had the power, those who made stuff, they made the decisions of how everything went. Very similar to how things go today. But I'm used that only as a reference to say that's how this country started. It started with slave-generated wealth by that 1% of the South, and they used it to expand all around them and to go west where there wasn't much at first, okay? But they moved west to get to have it to grow, because they had to build railroads, they had to build ports, and they had to build buildings with the names on them, all right? Wealthy slaveholders held disproportionate influence in state and federal governments. Many of the nation's early politicians, presidents, and congressional leaders were themselves slaveholders. Through law and policies, they maintained and protected the institution of slavery, enforcing strict codes that regulated enslaved people and stifled abolitionist movements. The elite class, the slave owners, they set the social tone, often viewed as cultural leaders, and promoted narratives that justified and defended slavery as a positive good, both economically and morally. Southern universities, churches, and social institutions were often influenced by or dependent on plantation wealth, reinforcing social norms that upheld slavery. Even after 1865, as the country entered Reconstruction, the slave owners were still able to preserve their wealth by passing it down because they still had land and they had resources and a government. Earlier, I mentioned about some of the institutions that benefited from slavery heavily. J.P. Morgan and Chase have acknowledged that their predecessor banks were, indeed, a part of the slave trade. Many prominent American Ivy League universities were established, expanded, or funded through the wealth derived from slavery. Donations and endowments from wealthy slave owners helped fund these institutions. Additionally, some colleges directly owned enslaved people who worked on campus. Who were some of these schools? Harvard University. They benefited from donations from wealthy families involved in the slave trade and the plantation economy. Harvard became an institution 140 years before the Constitution was written in 1776. In 2016, President Drew Gilpin Faust unveiled a plaque to honor 4 enslaved people who worked for Harvard presidents Benjamin Wadsworth and Edward Holyoke. Yale University. They received significant funding from slaveholding families and relied on donations tied to the slave economy. Yale University has several programs to recognize its history with slavery and the slave trade, including Yale Committee for Art Recognizing Enslavement, CARE. This committee works with the campus and New Haven communities to commission art and programming that addresses Yale's history with slavery. Georgetown University. They sold 272 enslaved individuals in 1838 to settle debts to keep the university financially solvent. While Georgetown does not offer specific scholarships exclusively for descendants, it provides various financial aid options to all students, including need-based and merit scholarships. Descendants applying to Georgetown are encouraged to explore these opportunities and discuss their unique circumstances with the university's admission and financial aid offices. Read between the lines, y'all. Another Ivy League school that benefited from it. First, I want to say all the Ivy League schools benefited from it some way, somehow. But I was able to take a group of kids to Brown University, as well as Harvard, and almost all the Ivy League schools. And at Brown University, we saw something different that no other school had. Inside the president's office, when you went to Brown University, there's a plaque on this wall, or there's a presentation on the wall, and it has something called Negro clothes. And on there, you see a little patch of the clothes that they made to send down south to the slaves. They made clothes specific for tasks, like field labor or house duties. Enslaved individuals wore what slave owners deemed appropriate. Field workers were often dressed in the most durable fabrics, while domestic slaves in the big house might have slightly better clothing, reflecting the owner's preference for appearance within the household. Sunday clothing, if provided by the slave owner, was usually a single, slighter, nicer outfit for church or formal occasions, though it was often still quite simple. This is where we get Sunday clothes from. Now, when we were riding up to Brown University, the city is almost null and void. There's almost nothing there but the university. And there were empty warehouses on both sides of the street as we were driving. It's just empty. It's a lot of empty warehouses, textiles, and just empty. You can tell they've been empty for years. And I told the kids going there, I said, do you know why these are empty? They said, no. I said, because these were the buildings that used to make these clothes that they sent down south for slaves. Okay, you gotta keep in mind, at that point in time in this country, in the 1860s, 50s, and the 1840s, slaves outnumbered slave owners 10-1. There were a whole lot more slaves in this country than there were slave owners, especially in towns like Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. They said that almost 40% of all slaves came through Charleston ports, and 20% of all slaves from the Middle Passage came through Savannah, Georgia. These places were full of African Americans, full of Africans. And the reason I wanted to take the kids up there to see that, I wanted them to understand and know everybody benefited from the slave trade. It wasn't just this thing that was just stuck in the South. No, most of the slaves were in the South. And there were only 33 states, and 18 of them were slave states. All right? I want you young people to understand this was a